I want to welcome you to Washington Legal Foundation's webinar program. My name is Glenn Lammy. I am Executive Director and Vice President for Legal Studies for Washington Legal Foundation. Those of you not familiar with the foundation, we are in our 46th year of free enterprise advocacy and education. We conduct our activities focused mostly on the courts and the regulatory agencies, but we also get involved in intellectual debates of the day through our publications, our programs, a blog, the WLF Legal Pulse, and other avenues as well. One of the issues that we've been engaged in for many years, going back to the Clinton administration, is the subject of our discussion today, environmental justice. Last week, to commemorate the one-year anniversary of President Biden's Justice 40 executive order, the White House issued a fact sheet on how the order and the larger goal of environmental justice advanced in 2021. The document listed numerous institutional steps and some successes, but the overall document reflected the reality that the Justice 40 initiative and the whole government approach to environmental justice remains a work in progress at the federal level. 2021 also saw some significant developments at the state level, as well as some tensions between EPA and state regulators involving specific permitting decisions that had environmental justice ramifications. 2022 is off to a somewhat rocky start for environmental justice proponents, with the departure of key EJ issue staff members from the Council for Environmental Quality, but with an entire activist movement pushing externally and an internal commitment from the president himself, this year we'll see a lot of activity that regulated entities must pay attention to. To provide an overview of last year's developments and help inform you about what's around the corner this year, we're pleased to have three attorneys from the Beveridge Diamond law firm with us today, two of whom did an environmental justice webinar with us in December of 2020. So I want to do the introduction of the speakers first. Julius Redd is a principal in the Washington, D.C. office of Beveridge Diamond. He represents clients in complex matters in civil litigation and administrative regulatory proceedings under the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Clean Air Act, and other acts that have complex acronyms. Also joining us today is Stacey Halliday, who is a principal in the DC office of Beveridge Diamond as well. Drawing on her diverse litigation and regulatory experience in government and in private practice, she focuses on corporate environmental due diligence, corporate social responsibility strategies, and program development, mandatory environmental disclosures, voluntary non-financial reporting, and green marketing. She was previously served as special counsel in the EPA's Office of General Counsel. Also with us is Hillary Jacobs, who's an associate with the firm. She maintains a general environmental litigation and regulatory practice. She holds an undergraduate degree in environmental studies and worked at the University of Maryland Environmental Law Clinic. And most relevantly for today's event, she serves as the deputy of the Environmental Justice Group. So we're going to be using a PowerPoint presentation today, and that's available in the chat function if you'd like to download that. And also, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function, and I will turn things over to our speakers.
Thank you very much, Glenn and Washington Legal Foundation, for having us. Again, we are pleased to be here. As you no doubt have figured out by now, my name is Julius Redd. I am an attorney in Beveridge Diamond's Washington, D.C. office, along with my colleagues Stacey Halliday and Hillary Jacobs. We lead our firm's environmental justice practice. Thank you all for making time to spend a few moments with us today, and hopefully you are able to learn something. As we move to the next slide, we're going to go, so I'll briefly go over the agenda for today. We're going to start off with a very brief sort of overview of environmental justice, just to level set and make sure we're all speaking the same language and are on the same page. Then we'll move on to discussing where we are with respect to federal EJ policy and what occurred in 2021, what we anticipate and expect will occur in 2022 and beyond. Thereafter, we'll give a brief overview of the EJ landscape at the state level. We'll discuss some examples with respect to how EJ is playing out in real life, in litigation and advocacy. Then we'll talk briefly about some best practices that we have seen. And then finally, hopefully we'll have some time for some question and answer. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Stacy.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having us. We're really excited to chat today. We figured, as Julius mentioned, we do a level set and just try and get some of the terms not so much settled. I love this slide because it's deceptive in the way that it seems to just answer the question, what is environmental justice? And it really turns out to probably raise more questions than it answers. But in most cases, we see the US EPA's definition as a building block for a definition of environmental justice, really pairing concepts of fair treatment and meaningful involvement for all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income. Now, this is sort of a meaty, for EJ nerds, this is such a meaty little paragraph because you're like, okay, what do you mean by fair treatment? And ultimately, that's no group of people should bear a disproportionate share of negative environmental consequences resulting from industrial, governmental, commercial operations or policies. Now, increasingly, we're seeing conversation not just about harm or adverse impacts, but also about benefits. And I think that's something else to keep in mind here when you think about what does environmental justice mean, especially as we think about just transition and energy changes. The Justice 40 initiative, which I think Julius will talk about later, and New York CLCPA are clear examples where equitable distribution of benefits from climate investment are a key part of thinking about how we move towards a low carbon future with an environmental justice lens. So that's something to certainly keep in mind. Something else to keep in mind here is that this definition, it's EPA's definition, it's used by a lot of other federal agencies as a starting point, but we're starting to see some shifts at the state level in how they define environmental justice, and more importantly, how they define environmental justice communities. So that's a moving target, something that's rapidly evolving. Justice 40 initiatives, interim guidance came out with some metrics that they might be using at the federal level, but we see states like New Jersey and New York using different metrics for how they look at these communities, how they're titled. So again, it asks more questions, it raises more questions than it answers, but just to keep in mind, this is a very much evolving space right now, but the basic ideas are fair treatment and meaningful involvement. That.
Thanks, Stacey. So I'm going to gloss over this slide pretty quickly because you all are here for insights into the future rather than the past, but I think it's important for us to start with where we started with the environmental justice movement. And the environmental justice movement is a part of and grew out of the civil rights movement. A few generations ago, there wasn't an environmental justice movement. It was really just called civil rights. While there are a lot of different places where we could point to as demarcating the origins of the movement, we typically start with the Memphis sanitation workers strike in 1968, when over 1,000 African-American sanitation workers protested against the Memphis Public Works abuse and neglect of its employees after a malfunctioning truck tragically killed 2 men. You may recognize that year, that was the year that Martin Luther King was assassinated, and these events are the events that actually brought him to Memphis to support the strike. A lot has happened since then, including a protest in North Carolina against the siting of a landfill for contaminated soil in an African-American community, and a number of other events that we could spend a lot of time talking about and digesting. But in the interest of time, we'll jump to the 1980s when the General Accounting Office in the United Church of Christ published the first reports conclusively linking the siting of hazardous waste facilities to minority communities. This may or may not have spurred ultimate federal action, and in 1994, we saw the first federal attempt to address environmental justice in a major way with the Clinton administration's issuance of Executive Order 12898. EO 12898 directed and still directs federal agencies to incorporate environmental justice into their work, and we'll get into this a little bit later, but it's being revisited now under new authorities. Since 1994, once again, we've seen a lot of different things happen, a lot of developments that have been gaining momentum and with increasing speed over the past couple of years. And that brings us to where we are today, this really unique point in time for environmental justice with the most federal activity we've seen and states increasingly addressing environmental justice. Next slide, please. So to continue to set the stage so everyone has context for the 2021 developments and the upcoming developments that we'll be talking about, I'll provide an overview of existing federal laws that address environmental justice. So we have executive orders, including the one I just mentioned, EO 12898, and we have a bunch more that the Biden administration has promulgated that we'll talk about in a few minutes. We have environmental laws, many of which can be interpreted to advance environmental justice through provisions requiring an analysis of health or other impacts. It really varies by statute. But for instance, there's a provision in the National Environmental Policy Act, what we environmental lawyers call MEPA, that requires the consideration of federal actions' impacts on social and economic factors. This is typically where in this extent of certain federal projects, you'll see environmental justice expressly addressed and considered. And I think it's likely that that consideration will be ramped up in the coming months and years. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We also have civil rights laws, and in the absence of a federal environmental justice law, there is no single environmental justice law on the federal scale, is what this slide you could take away from this slide. But in the absence of that, environmental justice activists have been pretty creative in using other existing laws to further EJ concerns. And it's maybe questionably creative, but the civil rights laws prohibit discrimination on the basis of race, national origin, and other grounds in a variety of scenarios, including surrounding the use of federal funding. So this is a great tool in some ways for environmental justice activists to use to advance their concerns. And we'll probably be touching on this a little bit more later, but with that, I will turn it over to my colleagues. Sorry, next slide, please.
Thanks, Hillary. So I think this is sort of an exciting time, and we've talked across the EJ practitioner community to really kind of suss out, is this really a transformational time? Why does it feel different now? And I think a lot of that comes from this whole of government approach, really executed from day one by the Biden administration. I mean, these first two executive orders, advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government, some long titles, lots of. So EO 13895 and EO 13990, really, they were on the first day. That first EO is the first EO, I believe, that the president issued. So really shows how much primacy this goal of equity and environmental justice has for this administration. So with the first EO, one of the components is a requirement that the National Climate Advisor and the Director of the National Economic Council develop a comprehensive government-wide climate risk strategy, and including identifying and disclosing climate-related financial risks. So we saw months after, in May 2021, the executive order on climate-related financial risk, which explicitly mentions environmental justice and cites that first executive order. So it's an example where we're seeing this pairing of climate policy and climate-related financial risk disclosures now with this concept of accounting for and addressing disparate impacts on disadvantaged communities and communities of color. So now this kind of blending and pairing in new ways of environmental justice with other issues that where it was previously siloed. With the EO 13990, that's the look back review of the Trump administration's environmental policies through adding, that should be done through an EJ lens to a certain degree, and accounting for the benefits of reducing climate pollution. But then there's the doozy, EO 14008, which was only 1 week later after the two others prior, tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad. And this is, the biggest action since Executive Order 12898 that Hillary mentioned, which really puts into place that whole of government approach requiring environmental justice be considered across all federal agencies, but also developing systems of accountability to revamp EO 12898, to issue agency scorecards that look at environmental justice performance, which we should be expecting sometime soon this month, and developing new bodies within the White House, like the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, which elevated, I think it has 27 members who are members of leaders of environmental justice organizations from across the country. And they're tasked with developing recommendations that go straight to the ear of the president, which we saw, I'll touch on in our next slide. But the executive order also really makes a huge emphasis on federal EJ-specific enforcement, which is a notable theme throughout the work that we've seen of this administration in the first year. Another notable theme in improving access and transparency and monitoring in frontline and fence-line communities. This is an enormous theme. I think monitoring and enforcement are really the two big actions that we've seen so far with an existing authority. And then finally, targets investments for EJ communities. And that gets to that Justice 40 initiative that we'll touch on in a bit. We can jump to the next slide, please. So those first three EOs are sort of like what we expected to happen. And this sort of gets to what we've actually seen. So the WEJAC was formed and they released their recommendations in May 2021, which looked to how Justice 40, how they believe Justice 40 should be put together, what updates should be made to EO 12898. And I think one of the really interesting takeaways from that recommendations document is it underscores the tension that this administration is facing with respect to achieving its climate goals, while also meeting its very lofty and ambitious strategy to incorporate EJ into all that it does. And you see that in the recommendations document, addressing things like use of nuclear energy and carbon capture, and EJ communities' rejection of those approaches in a just transition into a low carbon future. Whereas, I think it was a couple of days later, National Climate Advisor Gina McCarthy says, you know what, some of this stuff nuclear is probably going to have to be a part of what we do if we want to hit the marks that we want to hit with climate. So it begins a really interesting, that underscores the really interesting narrative that this administration is going to wrestle with. And I can only encourage the Shalonda Baker's book, Revolutionary Power, I think captures a lot of these themes if anyone's looking for a nightstand read. The Justice 40 initiative directs 40% of, this is part of EO 14008, directs the administration to put 40% of overall benefits from federal investments in climate towards disadvantaged communities. And I think right now, what the administration is struggling with is really figuring out, what does it mean when we say benefit? What does it mean to us versus what does it mean to EJ communities? Because it's a very nuanced, I think, definition. And then also, what do we mean by a disadvantaged community? So I think that's really where we're seeing, as I mentioned, that terminology being wrestled out at the federal level. But as part of the program, what we saw in the interim guidance that came out in July is that there are 21 pilot programs that were developed with Justice 40 stakeholder engagement plans, sort of embed the consultation with disadvantaged communities into the DNA of their efforts. So we are sort of waiting to see how those programs play out, what criteria were used, how this Justice 40 initiative will be rolled out in earnest through those pilot programs. And that's something that's really, I think, still pending, but something we should expect to see in the coming months. I think we're also seeing, particularly at EPA, we're seeing a lot of shifting agency EJ policies through enforcement memos, through significant enhancements in monitoring and enforcement. I think the most recent, we see the strategic plan that came out a few months ago, really highlighted these themes of monitoring and enforcement, but Administrator Regan's recent news release is a great example that the agency is going to be focused on unannounced inspections and really expanded monitoring efforts through their new pollution accountability team, which will use air monitoring through planes and ground monitoring by car, teamed with expert investigators from the agency to really amp up community-driven air monitoring efforts. So that paired with really focused enforcement and investigation actions should really increase the volume, I think, especially from EPA with respect to EJ. I think I'll just mention quickly that the legislation, we're seeing environmental justice. Certainly there were EJ bills that were proposed prior to the Biden administration, but we're seeing environmental justice come through in unexpected ways, like through the infrastructure bill, the COVID stimulus package, the Build Back Better. But with the infrastructure bill, we'll see a lot of money flowing through to different agencies with an emphasis and focus on that whole of government approach will be used, I think, to think about how those funds are spent. And that's something to keep in mind with respect to things like grants. And then in tandem with grants, Title VI enforcement and how those grants are used to, if they're used in a discriminatory way and how that might be impacted. So just a couple of themes to think of. I'll pass it back.
Thank you, Stacy. And so this is where we discuss what we anticipate to occur sort of this year and going forward. One of the items that Executive Order 14,008 required was this climate and economic justice screening tool. I believe under executive order, it was supposed to be rolled out last year. The administration didn't necessarily meet that deadline, but recent announcement from the White House indicated that a beta version of the tool will be released for public comment, I think, early this year. And we sort of heard through the grapevine that a beta version exists, and it's being reviewed internally for its efficacy and sort of where tweaks and other issues can be worked out. Additionally, Executive Order 14,008 requires a federal agency EJ scorecard. The scorecard is intended to assess federal agencies' progress in implementation of Justice 40 and other environmental justice priorities and commitments. I think under executive order that was supposed to be rolled out this month. We will see whether or not that actually occurs. If you were able to tune into any of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council public meeting last week, this scorecard was sort of progress on the scorecard was the subject a lot of discussion. Based on that, it doesn't appear that the scorecard will be released this month, but we shall see. So one of the topics that was discussed a lot was what consequences could be imposed on the scorecard for agencies that sort of did not achieve the intended goals. There was the concern was articulated that they want some consequences for the agency, but they also do not want to restrict funding to communities. Another requirement of Executive Order 14,008 are revisions to Executive Order 12898. Hillary referenced this earlier. I think this particular requirement has flown under the radar a bit, but we understand that the administration sort of hard at work at revising EO 12898. So we are expecting some revisions to that executive order this year. I guess I'll briefly mention the Justice 40 initiative. Hillary and Stacy both discussed it some, but last May, or excuse me, last July, interim guidance with respect to Justice 40 was issued, and it had some helpful information included in there with respect to what definitions of key terms might look like, and sort of offer a window into what the Justice 40 initiative might look like. Under that interim guidance, the federal agencies were supposed to submit methodologies to the Office of Management and Budget of calculating benefits under Justice 40. And I think my understanding of the intention of that is for OMB to sort of collect all that data and use that in determining how so-called benefits are calculated under Justice 40. So one, I think, issue that we will continue to see emphasized in 2022 and beyond is really the emphasis on enforcement. I believe it was just last week, on the heels of Administrator Regan's journey to justice tour, the EPA issued or I guess announced a new initiative in which they are EPA is really going to be prioritizing and focusing on EJ issues. I think that perhaps is one of the first tangible outcomes to come out of the journey for justice tours. And in that announcement of that initiative, EPA notes that it's going to use its authority aggressively to conduct unannounced inspections of suspected non-compliant facilities, increase air monitoring, both air monitoring and ground monitoring that Stacy alluded to earlier, work with state officials to take urgent action to help better protect communities, and seek to hold companies accountable for their actions in overburdened communities. So I think along with that and some of the activity that we have seen out of the Department of Justice, we will anticipate a emphasis on enforcement activity this year, and particularly with respect to some issues that are hot button issues these days. The ones that immediately come to mind are ethylene oxide and PFAS, P4 chemicals, but there are others. And there has been a lot of activity with regards to those chemicals, and particularly for, I guess, many facilities that either manufacture or use these materials are located in so-called overburdened communities or disadvantaged communities. So to the extent that those facilities are located in those communities, we really expect to see sort of increase and continued focus on those activities. Additionally, we anticipate seeing a renewed emphasis and focus on EPA fulfilling its civil rights mission. If you review EPA's draft strategic plan that they issued last year, there's a right focus on this aspect of EPA and taking some concrete action to fulfill that mission. So we sort of expect to see a lot of activity in that regard. And last, but certainly I don't think not least, an emerging area that we are seeing is a conversion of EJ and ESG issues. We anticipate seeing EJ working its way into ESG reporting requirements. A lot of the framework and standard setting agencies like SASB, TCFD, they are undertaking processes to revise or rethink or reframe what those standards look like. SEC chair as well has made comments indicating that climate issues and we think likely environmental justice issues are going to make its way under that umbrella with respect to non-financial reporting obligations. So we think that this is an emerging areas that particularly public companies should be paying attention to and be abreast of as we move into 2022 and beyond. And with that, I think I'm going to pass it back to Hillary to discuss what we're seeing at the state level.
Thanks, Julius. That was a robust set of predictions. And I think everybody really appreciated it. At least I did. So we're going to take just a few minutes to talk about environmental justice activity in the states as it's been and as we expect it to continue. So over the past couple of years, definitely predating the Biden administration, states have been increasingly more active with environmental justice issues in enacting new laws, adopting new policies, establishing new work groups, and a variety of different approaches over the last couple of years. The graphic on the right side of the slide gives a pretty good visual of the state of the environmental justice landscape as of March 2021. So obviously it's not current anymore, but it underscores the dynamic nature of environmental justice. And I will say, we've tried to make our own version of this and we have, but everything keeps changing. So we never use our own and keep going back to this Bloomberg graphic. So if anyone from Bloomberg is on, here's a request for an updated graphic from me. Thank you. A couple of states to point out that should now be blue, as in they have now enacted environmental justice legislation since this map was published, include Oregon, Colorado, Rhode Island, and Maine. Maybe missing some. And on the left, we've listed some of the most active or proactive states with respect to EJ as of lately. This is not inclusive. For instance, California is super active and they're not listed here. And Virginia is pretty active. They're also not listed here, but we just wanted to highlight a couple of examples. For instance, if you're here, you're probably familiar with the New Jersey 2020 law, landmark legislation, which can ultimately lead to a permit being denied entirely on environmental justice grounds. This legislation incorporates and requires the consideration of environmental justice in permitting for a variety of different types of facilities. The New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection is currently drafting regulations to implement the law, which is really interesting to watch unfold. They're dealing with some of the same definitional issues that the federal government is dealing with Justice 40 and figuring out the scoping and everything of how this very complicated law will play out in real life. In Colorado in July 2021, Colorado signed into law the Environmental Justice Act, which created an environmental justice task force responsible for conducting equity analyses for state actions with the potential to cause negative environmental or public health impacts on disadvantaged communities. The law also requires the state's Air Quality Control Commission to identify requirements for air permit applications that impact disadvantaged communities. It also requires the commission to adopt rules to reduce oil and gas emissions over a certain time frame. So a bunch of different things that this legislation accomplishes, many of which have great environmental justice implications. Very recently, just in January, Governor Roy Cooper of North Carolina issued a climate change executive order that sets out the state's path to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions, and it really emphasizes environmental justice. This executive order directs agencies to consider environmental justice when taking actions related to climate change, resilience, and clean energy, and to identify an environmental justice lead to serve as the point person for the agency's EJ efforts. So these are just a couple of examples. They highlight the different range of approaches and aggressiveness with which states are addressing environmental justice. It really does run the gamut. We definitely expect this to continue into 2022. It has not seemed to have lost any momentum, so expect more of this to come. And I'll pass it back to my colleagues for the next slide, please.
Thank you, Hillary, and I will second Hillary's request for an updated graphic. Stacy started. There's a lot going on at the state level with respect to environmental justice. So I will move through, I think, this slide rather quickly and just hit on some of the highlights. If you're here, you're probably aware of some of these issues already, and these are all publicly available sort of issues, so you can there's plenty of information for you to read up on them more. And not everyone here, I suspect, is a lawyer, so I suspect not everyone really wants to get bogged down into the minutia. But with that, the first example of how in recent years EJ has sort of played out in real life relates to the Friends of Buckingham versus the State Pollution Control Board. This litigation relates to the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, a compressor station that was proposed to support the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, was planned for the community of Union Hill in Buckingham County, Virginia. It's a predominantly Black community. And what I think is really a key takeaway from this particular litigation is that, as proposed, the compressor station would have complied with air emissions laws. But notwithstanding that, the Fourth Circuit determined that the Virginia State Air Pollution Control Board failed to perform its duty under state laws to consider the potential disproportionate health effects of the proposed compressor station on the nearby community. That, to me, is one of the key takeaways from that litigation. And then with respect to the proposed Formosa petrochemical facility, this is a 2,400 acre proposed petrochemical facility proposed to be developed in the so-called Cancer Alley area of Louisiana. That is a stretch of land between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. That is a heavily industrial area. There's a lot of presence of industry there, and most of the communities in that area are overwhelmingly Black communities. So there have been several litigations related to this particular facility, both at the federal and at the state level. One of the interesting things is the Army Corps of Engineers decided to suspend their grant of a wetlands permit and revisit their decision. At the state level, initially the plaintiffs in the case experienced success at the state level, and the presiding judge issued a pretty sharply worded opinion. On appeal, I think the Formosa prevailed and that the state judge was overruled. But as you can see, even if you are eventually successful in litigation, sort of these risks have the ability to delay permits and proposed development and slow down proposed developments in litigation, which of course come with a large additional cost that may not have been originally anticipated. With respect, the Chicago housing discrimination complaint is another interesting one because it involves a pretty novel use of civil rights laws to raise EJ concerns. There, it relates to a scrap metal facility that was proposed for a predominantly Latinx neighborhood in Chicago. One facility, the General Imes facility, was going to be closed, and the company that bought that facility proposed closing that facility and reopening another facility in that predominantly Latinx neighborhood. Part of that proposal included some type of arrangement they worked out with the city of Chicago for the city of Chicago to change zoning laws to permit that facility to be open in the predominantly Latinx neighborhood. That is where the civil rights hook was found. The proponents alleged that the city of Chicago violated Title 8 of the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which prohibits discrimination based on the basis of race, a national origin, and that is sort of how that litigation initially started. Since then, the proponents have also filed injunction in federal court, and then the company proposing the development went on the offensive, and they also filed their own lawsuit trying to force Chicago and the state of Illinois to issue the remaining permits that were necessary for that development to move on. The Chevron FTC complaint is interesting as well, and we flag it because it's sort of it's a first of a kind false advertising claim alleging violation of the Federal Trade Commission's green guidelines, in which the proponents allege that the company was misleading in his public statements by making itself appear more climate friendly and racially justice oriented than it actually is, as evidenced, as they allege, by the company's operations. This is, we think, interesting, and sort of what I flagged earlier as what may lie on the horizon with respect to the broader climate justice, climate change sort of a moment that we're in, and the overlay of EJ concerns with that. And then last, but certainly not least, this relates to, I'll say broadly, the federal government taking a more active role in fulfilling its mission of civil rights mission. This relates to the Department of Justice filing what is billed as the first ever affirmative Title VI complaint against a particular state agency. Here it relates to the Public Health Departments of Alabama and Loudoun County. The DOJ alleged that the state agency's wastewater disposal program and infectious disease program violate Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. And the hammer, so to speak, here is that potentially a recipient of federal funds can get that funding taken away if they are found to be in violation of Title VI. So as you can imagine, any state or local agency relies heavily on federal funding. So to have that funding taken away could really result in significant consequences for one who is eventually subject to a Title VI complaint that goes all the way through. And with that, I will turn it back over to my colleagues to take us to the next slide.
And we wanted to sort of close out before we jump into discussion on just a couple best practices that we share with our clients who are seeking, all of this is happening, what do we do about it? How do we operationalize this? How do we think about environmental justice for our own enterprise? So we usually suggest doing what I think the federal government's really doing right now, which is sort of set the baseline, get the key concepts defined, and get a sense of what you mean when you think of an environmental justice community. Look internally and do a self-assessment about where our facilities located. Are we near communities that regulators might consider an environmental justice community? And I think one of the key places that our clients start is developing an environmental justice policy as sort of a way to put all of those concepts together, and an external facing EJ statement. And I think one of the big benefits there is that you are messaging to very increasingly interested investors, as well as stakeholders and communities and regulators, that you care about this issue. You may not have all the answers yet, but you're working it and you're trying to incorporate it in your operations. With that, starting slow, as many, I think, ESG program or climate program, you think about setting reasonable, measurable performance goals, and then speaking accurately about them. To Julius's point about FTC enforcement, just making sure that you're being realistic about those goals and not aiming to address environmental justice and systemic racism all at once. And then finally, educating your team about environmental justice. We do a lot of trainings for anyone from project teams to C-suite folks to try and understand the basic concepts, what you are all doing today, and think about those in specific contexts of their industry and their company. From there, looking for a broader, more intense approach to environmental justice. Once that policy is written, once that internal self-assessment is done, then developing an implementation plan for how you put that policy into place. That could be anything from an expanded community engagement strategy to a way of incorporating environmental justice as a lens in project planning, and then also a documentation process. I think what we saw in the Friends of Buckingham case, it was really the State Air Control Board was the subject of the scrutiny, but ultimately the companies that were involved in putting the pipeline together were also hit with a pretty significant penalty, but there was significant harm done to that project. So thinking about having documentation process, if you have an environmental justice analysis process, there are notable benefits to saying, okay, well, the permit authority might not have done this review, but we have, and this is how we've thought about it. So it's a good way of showing that you are doing your own review, your own due diligence. And then finally, expanding public outreach and participation, using the research you're doing, using the public data that you can access, like EJ Screen, to assess the communities that your operations are near, where your assets are located, and using that information to develop early, often meaningful engagement with the community so that you can tell your own story and not let others tell it for you. I'll pass it to Julius.
Thank you very much, Stacy. So this last slide, we have discusses some facility level EJ considerations that you might want to implement to mitigate some of the risks that we are discussing. First, the law seems pretty basic, but as we discussed here today, this area is very dynamic. There are updates and changes literally on a daily basis. It's hard to keep up. And as we are seeing more proactive requirements come online, just make sure that you understand those and what it may mean for your operations. Best defense is a good offense. Sort of in line with some of the concepts Stacy just articulated. Or be proactive, have a plan, understand how to reach and engage with your key stakeholders. Another good idea may be to identify offsite exposure concerns and sort of identify offsite exposure concerns, and to the extent it's not cost prohibitive, implement mitigation measures. Get to know your neighbors. It's another best practice that we often counsel our clients with. There are data tools available to help you get a better understanding of your neighbors. EJ Screen is one of them. We discussed the climate and environmental justice screen tool that's going to be rolled out soon. But and then some of the other ones that are listed on the slide are, of course, self-explanatory. I don't think I need to elaborate much more on those, but I do want to just quickly touch on a couple of additional ones that are not on the slide, and particularly in light of the new initiative that EPA is rolling out on the heels of the administrator's journey to justice tour. So we know we have the EPA is telling us that they are going to be conducting unannounced inspections. So if your operations are located in a disadvantaged community, particularly if you have had instances of non-compliance in the past, be prepared. Train your staff on what to do, what not to do. And we have worked with many clients and offer training in this regard, and have some specific best practices and suggestions that we can provide. But I think that's really a prudent risk mitigation measure, particularly because the administration has telegraphed that they are going to be doing this. So I think you'll be well served in sort of engaging in that exercise. Additionally, Stacy noted earlier that EPA is going to be conducting much more monitoring. And we also know that with the proliferation of PM 2.5 meters and other citizen science, the community now has more tools to monitor the emissions around your facility and in their neighborhoods. It may be a good idea for you to do the same, just to have an idea of what they are looking at. There's sort of a old saying that good data trumps bad data, but bad data trumps no data. If the only data that's available is what some community member has been able to come up with using a $15 PM 2.5 monitor, that might not present the most accurate levels in that particular community. So you, with that knowledge, you should, to the extent it makes sense, you should also be engaging in those practices as well. And this is another area where, from our experience, we have some best practices that we can that we counsel our clients on ways to do this properly. So to ensure that you're not creating bad data, well, I should say, to mitigate the risk that you're not creating bad data for yourselves. So with that, I think we're going to turn it back over to Glenn to lead us through the Q&A session.
Thank you very much. We do have quite a few questions from our online viewers. I will ask them in the order that they were asked. The first one is, are you aware of any companies or organizations that already have identified EJ as an explicit ESG metric or goal? If not, it sounds like that is a distinct possibility in the future, correct?
Yeah, I think this is an emerging area where we're seeing shifts at this point. This is one of the reasons we're trying to advise clients to get ahead of it. And I think a lot of the action we're seeing is from investors asking these initial questions during the proxy season. Like, this is where we're going to start to see that push in the private sector. While the federal government gets there, we're going to see, I think, investors driving that forward. And we saw that with some of the investor activism last year in the energy sector. So I think, it's ESG reporting is tough because you can't just build these pipelines for reporting and tracking and developing these metrics overnight. It's really being thoughtful about how you do it in your own company, in your own enterprise, how you define these terms and do this analysis, and then being prepared to develop those statements and external comments. So with those, reliable, thought through metrics. So that's, I think at this point, we're seeing more policies developed, and that's sort of, I think, where a lot of companies are. That's the preliminary step, is saying the words environmental justice out loud and committing to them. In terms of delivery and measurement and assessment reporting, that's probably the next step. And I think the SEC regs on climate may, incorporate some of that and drive a lot more activity in that space.
Yeah, I mean, I generally agree with everything that Stacy just articulated. I would just add that sort of beyond the federal government, the federal regulator, we are seeing other stakeholders much more interested in this area. As an example, the shareholder advocacy group, As You Sow, released a report last year. At first, they focused on the S&P 500 companies, but now they have expanded their analysis to the entire Russell 1000, in which they assess companies on various ESG metrics, and one of those being environmental justice. So we're sort of seeing it from that shareholder advocacy side. We're also seeing it from the investment side. I mean, if you haven't looked at it, you might want to consider taking a look at recent letters to shareholders from large institutional investors, from BlackRock, from State Street. There are others where they are, these large institutional investors are really making a pointed discussion that they don't view ESG as sort of the fleeting thing of the day. They really see this as driving shareholder value, and I think as more objective measures, a way to assess environmental justice start coming online, that will work its way into these ESG metrics and considerations as well. I think we recently saw similar types of comments from, I want to say, the Comptroller of New York, in which he wrote to Bear's company CEO, saying that the pension fund will be selective in its investment decisions, and will be considering ESG in those decisions. So there are sort of regulators and federal drivers, and mandatory disclosure is sort of one stakeholder to have visibility and be concerned about. But I think there's also other stakeholders beyond the regulators that I think prudent companies should be evaluating and implementing into their reporting requirements and decisions.
So another question is, are you seeing EJ in supply chain, for example, requirements for suppliers to have EJ policy programs or to report to customers?
It's a great question. I think that's something that, again, kind of is going to be an outgrowth when we think about environmental justice as part of an ESG framework that's, again, measurable and develops, systems of more specific accountability. We're going to see that, I think. And I think we're going to see it in interesting ways that implicate global consideration of environmental justice, because obviously there are a lot of interests that are overseas with respect to manufacturing and large environmental footprints. So thinking about environmental justice as a human rights issue, you start thinking about your human rights disclosures, how would environmental justice overlay into that conversation? So I think that's something that may be developing. And, you know, when you think about sustainability 10 years ago, where it is now, I think that might be where we're headed, particularly because organizations like the UN are you know, already talking about environmental justice as a human rights issue when they look at certain portions of Louisiana. So I think, you know, again, something that's on the horizon is something to prepare for, that we're not seeing in earnest just yet, but it's just over the cusp and you don't want to be caught in your heels.
And I'll just raise one additional point. I think a lot of companies already do have lots of human rights supply chain due diligence programs. And so some companies are already doing some of this to some extent, given the overlap between human rights and environmental justice. It's just not being called environmental justice, and it doesn't have the environmental lens that we're talking about here. So I think Stacey is spot on. We're going to be seeing this shift and become more specific type of requirements.
So two questions that sort of together relate to environmental policy and corporate due diligence. One, how does the use of environmental audits sort of figure into this with a lawyer, obviously, and do you recommend changes to environmental due diligence in the corporate governance context related to EJ?
Oh, yeah, that's a very great question. And so one, as a strategy tactical approach, you can certainly retain counsel who can retain an auditor on your behalf to maximize the extent that privilege, attorney-client privilege, will be will cloak that audit. So I do think to extent your operations warranted, it may be prudent to conduct an environmental audit to assess where your operations are on with these issues. And audit reports typically point out where you may not be meeting a standard, and then they have corrective actions, and implementing those corrective actions to close any gaps that are observed. And I've been talking so much that I hate to admit that I forget the second question there, Glenn, or maybe
environmental due diligence in sort of in the context of EJ.
Yes, and I think that is one mitigation strategy that can be used to ensure that companies sort of have visibility into potential EJ risk and implement controls to mitigate those risks.
And if I could jump on just there to follow on, I think this is such an exciting time because we're seeing that migration of EJ into a space that looks more like ESG and trying to think about metrics. So I think like the As You Sow scorecard as an example, and you look at like sustainability ratings organizations like Sustainalytics and ISS and MSCI, they have criteria that we might start seeing in this sort of due diligence framework, thinking about controversies issues and thinking about governance. What do you have in place in terms of board level experience and a designated person in your organization who addresses EJ? I think that's really where we're going to be going, and thinking about that in your organization. I mean, I think I bug Julius and Hillary about this all the time. Like, man, in our free time, we should sit around and put together a set of metrics and a scorecard, how we're going to, propose this to our clients. But it ends up being a little bit more bespoke and custom, client by client. But we're definitely on the edge of that, and I think the federal government's going to nudge us a bit in terms of how they're going to be assessing individual facilities and how they make their decisions and determinations.
So to me and to Washington Legal Foundation, one of the most interesting aspects of this is how environmental justice is discussed and implemented in the permitting process. You have, entities that have permits currently that may be going for renewals, they may be getting new permits. So I'll mention one example of a new permit where this came up in Michigan, near Flint, Michigan, Genesee Township. There was a asphalt plant that was seeking a permit for construction, and EPA got very involved in that in terms of sending letters back and forth, talking to the state regulators, and the permit was issued, but with some really unique conditions. What lessons can be learned from what happened in that approval process?
So I'm happy to jump in, and then if anyone has further thoughts, they're welcome to obviously go after me. But I just to give a little, I know of the example you're talking about, Glenn, in the Ajax asphalt facility and right next to Flint, Michigan, in which the local state agency issued an air permit for this new facility. It was a new source review permit, I think, and EPA weighed in, and there was a lot of discussion among the community who weren't super happy with the fact that they were already in an industrialized area, already had a lot of environmental burdens, and that they were seeing this additional facility being proposed and permitted. So I know one of the things that happened there, and I'll get back to your broader question about permitting, but I just want to give folks a little bit of background on this particular example. I know that the agency ultimately sent a letter after the day it issued the permit saying, you know, we've done everything we can here. We've taken extraordinary measures in public participation that we've never done before. But we are, you know, we could use your help. We could use more help in figuring out how we can go about incorporating environmental justice into the permitting programs that we have delegated authority for. And I think that example really highlights the differences that we're going to see between permitting that is conducted directly by EPA on the federal level and permitting that is conducted by states under delegated authority. So according to its 2022 to 2026 strategic plan, EPA is going to be taking into account EJ and civil rights issues into its permitting decisions across all program areas. And what this will mean for EPA permitting actions that are directly regulated by EPA as opposed to a state agency. That'll depend largely on the statute, but it really, I think it will mean a closer consideration of the permit's impacts to the surrounding communities, more outreach, more public engagement, enhanced public participation. But for delegated authorities, like the Michigan example highlights, this can look different. EPA can comment on individual permits during the comment period, but to raise environmental justice issues, state incorporation of EJ will vary more. And I think it will depend on how willing the state is to interpret existing environmental laws to include environmental justice provisions. That will vary widely depending on the agency we're looking at, the administration's political bent, and how far they're willing to go. Michigan, this example provides a good example of an agency that did go further than it thought it was required, because that's what the public comment participation yielded feedback for. So I don't know if I've answered your question. If someone else wants to jump in after me, I just rambled for a bit.
I think that was fantastic, and I think you touched on a lot of the points that I would have touched on as well. I think one thing that I would just also spin off that that you raised in part was just, I think the folks at EPA, particularly the politicals who came over for the Obama administration, came in, I think, thinking, you know, how do we embed more permanent changes in the work that we're doing? And that, I think, comes with an environmental justice angle and goal as well. And thinking about the regulatory work they're doing in terms of EPA setting minimum requirements and regulations. So I think, you know, the rulemakings will certainly, we saw that with the HFC phase down, things like that, where environmental justice is front and center in a way that it hasn't been before. So I think that's something to certainly keep in mind. I think the agency is getting creative about that sort of work and thinking long term. Plan, I can't help but make a pitch for Plan EJ 2014 legal tools as a way to, it's a cheat sheet and we shouldn't share it, but it's so good. For those who haven't reviewed it, it's such a good resource to say, okay, where can the agency assert existing authority, including in situations where there's delegated authority. So something to keep in mind.
So in the context of emissions by plant that's permitted under law, if they're being put out in an area that disproportionately affects environmental justice communities, is the only sort of avenue for those people that want to see that stop. Is that still Title VI, filing a complaint with EPA against basically the permitting authority in the state, or have other avenues opened up since then?
I think Title VI is definitely one. To the extent it's an air permit, and we're talking about Title V permitting, we've seen a lot of activity with respect to EJ concerns being raised in that context as well. Under NEPA, I would anticipate the revisions that we see come out of CEQ will have opportunity, I guess I'll say greater opportunities for communities and other proponents to raise EJ concerns as well.
I think we'll see some too in terms of the work that FERC does, and just, you know, that whole of government aspect really changes the game in terms of types of claims you can raise. I mean, Title VI even, you know, Title VI is not exclusive to EPA. So we see, you know, it was first, I think, used a lot in the education context. So we see Title VI change in the education context, that can have vast implications for in the environmental space. So just something else to keep in mind.
Not to pile on, but one other thing I think that we've seen a lot, and this goes outside of any traditional avenue, is just, you know, your standard, assuming I understood your question correct, Glenn, your standard make a racket and make a lot of noise and get a lot of attention. We've seen this a lot in the past year of the administration, where communities have been outspoken with respect to their feelings on a facility that they don't necessarily want. And that has led to EPA's direct involvement. I'm not saying this is going to happen every time, but we've seen this in the context of the Chicago HUD example. We've seen this in a little bit in Lime Tree Bay and in St. Croix. And I just think that that is something that will continue.
So one last question here. Is there now a general law regarding that EPA and state environmental boards must consider not only the emissions of one plant, but the cumulative emissions of an entire area before granting permits, or to either expand or build a new house? That's a big area, the cumulative emissions. Where does things stand on that?
So as of now, there is no such legislation. There have been efforts to introduce or legislation along those lines have been introduced in the past. Senator Cory Booker did introduce one. Senator, when she was Senator Kamala Harris introduced legislation along those lines. So as we currently sit here, there isn't one. And to forecast, I do not anticipate such legislation passing, sort of given the current makeup of the Congress and midterms sort of around the corner. I don't think that we'll see such a comprehensive EJ legislation. Where I do think cumulative impacts will likely be considered more, will be in the context of NEPA, whenever we see additional work come out from some CQ.
And I know, go ahead, Stacey.
Please go for it.
Wait, mine is very short. I know the question was about EPA and states, but I think if you're looking at states, it's kind of a different analysis. States only, it's a different analysis. So I think arguably New Jersey's environmental justice law that we talked about earlier requires just this. And there's a lot of copycat legislation out there, at least there was last year, mirrored off of the New Jersey legislation. So we could see this coming up on a state by state basis. Stacey?
Yeah, just a quick point that I think we're seeing actions at EPA in terms of setting screening assessment standards, and there's the TSC screening assessment standard for fence line communities, things like that, that are going to start to adjust boundaries and may have impacts in broader ways. I'm not a TSCA expert, but just, setting it however many mile boundary to assess potential exposure impacts in fence-line communities, that may drive changes in a broader way when you start to think about cumulative impacts, especially industrial dense areas where it's hard to parse sources of a particular pollutant. So just something to watch as well. That's kind of on the periphery with big implications.
So since we're all sitting in Washington, it's hard for me to resist asking a Washington sort of insider type question, which is, I had sort of made reference in the beginning to the departures from CEQ. How do you think that's going to impact administration policy, especially in the NEPA area? I know they're very deep into trying to develop that.
I as much of a shift, and I think at the beginning of the year as it was to see Cecilia Martinez and her deputy leave CEQ, I think there's still a strong bench and commitment across this administration to continue furthering these EJ goals. I think there's going to be, obviously there's already CEQ had a lot in its plate, even with the two of them there, and I think they're already kind of struggling to hit some deadlines. So I think we're still going to be waiting well into the year to see some significant outcomes there. But I think, across the administration, they've created new environmental justice positions. The White House has hired folks in significant roles who have environmental justice experience. So I don't think the train's going to stop. That might be a slight delay.
Yeah, agreed. I think I would suspect that EJ proponents would look at the departure of Cecilia Martinez and her chief deputy as setbacks. But I think, to me, one of the biggest takeaways from the first year is that we are seeing this whole of government approach permeate the entire administration. So from agencies in the past, historically, EJ was pretty much just relegated to the EPA. I mean, I think nowadays that's clearly no longer the case. We are seeing agencies that really never before view themselves as having a role in EJ, finding ways to implement environmental justice considerations as they fulfill their mission. And I think that sort of shift in thinking and shift in the ways how agencies view their mission is sort of here to stay, at least in this administration. And I think we'll continue to see agencies look for ways to, in the course of fulfilling their mission, also sort of fulfill the two goals of the Biden administration, which is combating climate change and prioritizing environmental justice.
Well, we are a little bit over our time, but I want to thank everyone for joining us today and thank our speakers for taking the time to offer their thoughts and strategies to you. If you came in late or you know someone who might be interested in watching this, we will have it as an on-demand video on our website by first thing tomorrow morning, probably. And again, I want to thank all the speakers and everyone for joining us today.
Thank you,
Everyone.